think he should be punished? Yes and no. Yes, because in my panic, I lied and I destroyed evidence. But no, not for her murder. And I'll accept punishment for her death, but not for her murder. I would understand a penalty for her death because it happened and because I played a major part in it. So I don't really believe that I'm guilty of murder.
Westminster Police hoping you can help find this missing 19-year-old. She's Leah Charlie Porter. She lives in Pueblo, but she was in Westminster last Thursday when she went missing. Now take a look. Porter's hair is dyed blonde, but she has brown hair. She also has a tattoo on her wrist and her lower lip is pierced. You can call Crime Stoppers or Westminster if you have any information to help find her.
How many years did you know him total?
He was only an acquaintance to me, just someone I knew at school, you know. I didn't really, he was creepy to me. I heard that he had thoughts of raping and killing a certain girl while he was in high school.
You described Chris as being creepy in high school and weird. Can you describe, the creepiness?
He looked frustrated with himself all the time. He would get frustrated with girls because in his head they would be flirting with him. And I talked to everybody I went to school with, not once. Nobody flirted with him. Not one person.
Knowing that Christopher Wade had some very dark and particularly sadistic urges and fantasies as young as teenage life in high school would be reason for any parent to be concerned. And Max Porter, because he went to school with Wade and was aware of these rumors, he's understandably really worried about his sister.
She said she was tired and she just wanted to crash, so I said okay. And I found some of her drugs and confronted her about it that night. Then shortly afterwards, she took off. And I didn't really think much of it. I thought she was just angry at me because I was playing the part of a concerned friend. Overall, she seemed pretty depressed, and while she was smiling, it didn't really go to her eyes. So that kind of was weirding me out to see her like that.
Wade presents here as somebody who's really nervous. His answers almost seemed like they were written for him. Like he's thought about what he was going to say and he's going by his script. Very stilted, very uncomfortable. And he drops comments here and there, almost comments like he thinks he should say. Like he was concerned about her drug addiction. He found drugs. She seemed depressed. But there's really not a lot of emotion behind what he's saying. It's almost to me like he's more concerned about saying the right thing during this interview than he is about not knowing where his friend is.
What are your concerns right now as a friend?
Well, overall, I just want her to be safe. I don't really have very many friends, but the friends I do have, I'm very loyal to. So even losing one is a heavy blow for me.
Refers to having already lost a friend. This has been also seen in other cases where people make a slip. It does raise their suspicion. Some people would say that's due to what we call the guilty knowledge in our head. And that influences the way we think and the way we speak. And he probably didn't intend to say it that way, but you can probably believe it's true. He's already lost that friend.
You seem really shaken right now.
Yeah, it's definitely intimidating because I'm more of the person to listen and not speak. So with everyone trying to get in touch with me and ask me what happened, it's kind of, it's been a real sort of shock to my system. Overall, I'm not really handling the situation very well. So far, I was told that I'm not a suspect, but I just want to be as cooperative as possible to make sure that, I stay that way.
He's expressing a concern that the reason he's cooperating with police is because they're telling him he's not a suspect, and he wants to make sure he continues to control that narrative and ensure that he stays off their radar. But what Wade's engaging in is constant impression management. The problem is he doesn't think quickly on his feet, and when it's not rehearsed, you see these awkward behaviors and these cognitive leaks come out in the media interview.
We want to just talk to everybody that, has ever possibly known her or had any relationship with her. Can you fill me up in a little bit of Christopher's history growing up? How did he do in high school?
He kind of struggled in high school. He... not really withdrawn. He's a different thinker. Growing up, his dad was into pornography. And Chris found it online at a very young age. Chris was pretty messed up with it in high school.
Okay.
I found he stashed pictures of every sort. It made me sick. I heard things from, the principal called me one day and said he had touched a girl inappropriate at school.
What we now understand about pornography addiction and the influence of pornography exposure on young children as their brains are developing and their sexual identity is developing is that it sets up an expectation around sexuality, intimacy, and interacting with sexual partners that's highly unrealistic. And what also seems quite clear is that there were early warning signs, and his family chose to minimize the seriousness of those.
Now, what about, does he confide in you with any specific fantasies that you would be concerning?
I have to tell you.
I would really appreciate it.
He said that he went out one night, and we didn't know it. And he went to some girl's trailer.
Okay.
We live out in the mountains. And so he walked over there and went in with the intention of kidnapping her and taking her out in the woods.
Do you think he actually did that?
I don't know. I didn't think so, but he told me that he did a couple of times. He told me that he went to her trailer in the middle of the night and that he was going to kidnap her, but the dog started barking or something, and so he got scared and left.
Here we have Wade's own mother confirming the rumors and the other perceptions that Leah's family has about him. When you think about these red flags of not only express sexual fantasies, violent, deviant fantasies, but also actual behavior where he enacted some of those fantasies. When you take that with what we have in this current situation where he's being investigated for a missing woman, it certainly is very concerning when you think about all the history that we have thus far.
But since he's gotten out of high school, he's gotten himself on a really good track, and he went into the Army. He did some deployment time. He started having nightmares in deployment, and they sent him back.
For psychiatric reasons?
Yes.
You know, was he diagnosed with anything?
No.
The psychological evaluation from the United States Army that was done in preparation for Wade's discharge paints a very different picture than what his mother wants to believe or what he maybe told her. Wade was quite forthcoming with the doctor that he has ongoing urges and fantasies of raping a specific classmate. And what the doctor ultimately says, which is both alarming and quite astute, is that while there's no evidence that Wade has harmed anybody, he's dangerous, he has the potential for dangerousness.
What's your gut feeling? You're his mom.
About Leah is I totally believe that he has not done anything.
I want you to understand that you're not in custody, that you know we're focusing in on you to make an arrest or something like that. That's not the case.
Okay. I know that much.
You understand that?
Yeah, I'm studying criminal justice. So I kind of know how these things sort of work.
Okay.
Learning about a lot of this stuff in class.
In this particular scene where he's being interviewed by the police and they're going, oh, I do, criminal justice. So a way of saying, I'm kind of like you. Like, we have something in common. It's his effort to control the image of him in the police's eyes, to make him look like he's cooperative, he's on board, he's a good person. It's part of his image of being the helpful friend.
When you talked to our officers on the 5th, which was, you think, last Thursday, what did the cops tell you?
They got my statement. They were asking me, what happened. And there wasn't anything new, so they were just calling me to try and get it straight from the horse's mouth of the facts. I know I talked to Lee's mom, Renee, as well as her brother, Max. He was, I think he was skeptical because he thought I had done something, but...
Why do you say that?
Just in his mannerisms, it seemed like he was under the impression that I was since I was the last person to see her, that I therefore must be the person that did something to her. I told him that I did a tarot reading for her, but I didn't learn anything of where she might be from it, so I didn't think it was important.
You did a tarot reading while she was with you?
Yes.
Or before she left? Or after she left?
While she was with him. I treated her out to lunch. I was being as courteous as possible to her. But throughout the whole time, the smiles never went to her eyes. Amy. Well, normal smiling will cause the eyes to start to crinkle a little bit, to squint. But when she was smiling, it was just with her mouth. There wasn't any eye movement. That tells me that she was telling the truth when she was depressed. But now that I think about it, it just might have been that she didn't like lying to me.
Here, Wade is almost presenting himself like he's an expert in behavioral analysis and almost teaching the investigators about what a real smile looks like and how he's able to discern when she's telling him the truth or not. He wants them to believe that he knows more than he really does and that he's a different person than he really is. He's lying and manipulating.
And then afterwards, she just asked, I'm tired, can I just pass out for a while? And then about, an hour and a half after, that was when my roommate came back home. Well, for the most part, she was asleep in my bed. And I started thinking, and she had that bag with her that she didn't let leave her side.
And in fact, you later looked in that bag.
Yes.
Or what
Afterwards, I saw her drug paraphernalia. I woke her up very gently. Yeah, I apologized to her because I had looked into the bag.
What was her response to you violating her privacy?
I think she understood where I was coming from because, as I told her, I was worried about her. And not because I have any sort of physical or emotional attraction to her. I wouldn't mind if something like that developed in the future. And I made sure that she understood that I was not angry with her for doing it or using, but that I was disappointed that she didn't come forward with that to me. And she was annoyed, yes, but not irritated.
We see this parent-child judgmental quality in Wade's attitude time and time again. What we also need to pay attention to is that, consistent with what we see with psychopathic offenders oftentimes, is this shallow affect. There's this shallowness to his emotions. They're superficial. He's using all these flowery words as if he's rereading a script that he's worked out in his head that is gentle and soft and almost romantic in nature. And yet, the words and content he's describing is an ugly confrontation about drug paraphernalia. And the two just don't add up.
Well, Chris, I'm going to ask you flat out right now. Do you know where Leah is? Did you do something?
I did nothing to her beyond what I've already said. And honestly, I have no idea where she is. A lot of things that could have happened. To me, the most logical things are that she took the advice from my tarot reading beyond the level that I intended. Or that she is just has fallen back into using drugs, and that she is ashamed to talk to people right now.
Explain to me how you ended up doing the tarot reading for her.
After I laid out the cards, the first thing that popped out to me were that there were 3 of the major arcana. Those indicate something significant. I explained the combination for the Ace of Wands and the High Priestess. The 3 of Cups is representative of something to be celebrated. So overall, there was nothing to me, as far as the tarot card reading, to indicate any sort of physical harm to her.
Okay. What else did you tell her that the cards showed?
Overall, I told her that this was was one of the more optimistic readings that I had ever done.
But are you encouraging her to start a new life?
I encouraged her more off of the death side to, trim the tree and, take a close look at her life and to trim off what was being a bad influence.
So the part that makes no sense is he's just said to the police, maybe she took the intent of my reading too far. But when he's explaining the reading, it's supposed to be a joyous, celebratory thing. There's nothing malevolent in the reading that says, die, hurt yourself, bad things coming up. She's off celebrating, or she's in a good space, which is really incongruous. Why would you be worried? So the police have a right to be suspicious of it.
Once she got in that truck and left your parking lot, you would not
That was
seen
the
her
last
since.
I have seen her.
So is there any reason why we would find Lee's blood in your apartment? Or in your car?
When we were starting to get a little more physical, we accidentally bumped into each other. We had a nosebleed. I didn't really think much of it at the time, so after she got up, I cleaned up the little bit of a mess. I mean, it wasn't a major gusher, it was just a couple of drops.
We see Wade stumble here. He didn't expect law enforcement to kind of confront him about some of the blood evidence, to confront him and push him, and because he hadn't thought about that, he didn't have a rehearsed answer. He didn't have an explanation, but it is also important to note the ease with which he just makes something up, and that kind of pathological, compulsive ability to lie and just fill in the blanks is something we consistently see time and time again in psychopathic offenders.
So where are your sheets and your pillow?
My pillows are currently on my bed. As far as the sheets, I have no clue. Checking stuff in the laundry pile isn't something you really remember all that much, so it was routine.
You didn't get rid of the sheets?
No.
It seems inconsistent to us based on the condition of your apartment that you would be all of a sudden in the middle of a sexual experience taking your sheets and taking them off the bed.
Let's face it, your apartment's not exactly the tidiest. Okay?
I'll be the first to admit that.
It just doesn't make sense.
Honestly, when you put it that way, it doesn't really make much sense to me either. Two words that would describe me almost perfectly would be unorthodox and weird. And I'll straight up admit it that I'm probably one of the weirdest guys most people would probably know.
The only thing we ask is to tell us the truth. What's the deal with the sheets?
Alright, yeah, I did get rid of it.
Her cell phone ended up at the same place the sheets did at the bed.
I do not know. Honestly, I saw her leave with her cell phone.
How do you know she left with the cell phone?
This is the time for you to be honest with her.
Yeah, I'm just trying to find the right words because I know that I have been untruthful. I'll straight up admit it, it bugs me to hell that I have been. But yes, her phone was with the sheets.
They're throwing out information that they don't yet really have, like her cell phone was found, right, with her clothing. And you hear Wade sigh. He's got to come up with a new story. And he goes, no, I saw her leave with her cell phone. But then you hear him sigh again. He's working really hard at trying to figure out. So when he then finally says, I'm searching for the right words, I believe him. He's trying to figure out what is the best way I can frame this.
Is she lying in the dump somewhere?
God, no. That's something That's something I've had nightmares about. Hearing that she's been found somewhere in a dump someplace. I really do not want that for her.
So where is she?
Honestly, I do not know. She left and got into the truck.
Chris, this is a place where you need to tell us what happened to Lee.
Am I being accused of something?
What do you think?
It sounds to me like yes. And I maintain my innocence, but I would like a lawyer.
Yes, I'd like to confess to a murder.
Okay. What happened?
The case is into the disappearance of Lee Porter.
Ma'am? What? Can you take a deep breath? What's your name? My baby, my little baby. What are you calling about? That guy just admitted he killed my daughter.
The last couple days, I've been playing buddy-buddy with him over text, trying to make him think that we didn't think he did it. We got him to meet up with us to do a tarot card reading for my sister. And then I told him, I was like, I know you know where my sister is. And then he looked in my eyes and he said, I know.
Chris. I know.
Look at me right in my eyes. Dude, where is she?
Okay, look, and you have every right to be angry with me for lying to you. And I will be going forward with the police about this. I haven't yet because I'm trying to find the right way to do it.
This is the right way, right?
Yeah, I know. But what I say right now, it's going to be very hard. But until I come forward with them to it, it'll be within the week, I swear to you. But I'm gonna have to ask you to keep it to yourselves until then.
A great moment where you get a peek sort of into thinking of a psychopath who is self-absorbed. And he keeps saying, I know this is gonna be hard for you to hear. It's not really empathetic. His expectation is they should accept it on his terms. But that's the manifestation of control that you do see with psychopaths. They want to be in charge of the information and in control of other people's feelings about it.
Tell me right now what happened to my sister. You know what happened to my sister.
She wasn't yelling, but she was very venomous. And she grabbed the knife that I keep by my bed. And when we go back, I can show it to you. She grabbed it and pulled it out and tried to attack me.
She wouldn't do that, dude. She wouldn't do that. Chris, stop lying.
Then after I was coherent enough to start functioning again, I'll admit it, I wasn't rational, and I did things that I should not have with what happened next. And I swear I didn't tie her up. I put the 2 trash bags underneath because after I got rid of her, I didn't want the smell to attract anyone. And they were those odor control trash bags. I put a bag over her head, and then I placed 2 on top of her. I know you won't believe me, but I will be turning myself in to the police. I will tell them.
No, you're going to jail right now. You're going to prison right now. Call the cops.
What were the verbal threats she made to you?
She kept on saying, I need the drugs, you have to get them for me. And if you don't, then I'm going to cut you.
So she actually used the words, I'm going to cut you?
Yes. I'm sure she intended to, and based off of the acidity in her voice, I'm sure she intended on very deep wounds.
At what point did she grab the stuff?
It was shortly after she had threatened to come here to the police station to report that I had raped her.
He's now tossed in the word rape, and he's now woven it into the story to make him the victim, that he was going to be accused of rape, and that he was defending himself. But he, in the story, is the victim. It's consistent with how he's tried to represent himself all the way along.
She grabbed the knife, and she started thrusting it at me. It was overhand, straightforward. I dodged the first one, and the second time I grabbed her hand and spun her around so that her body was between the knife and myself. And I placed my hand right at her throat. And then after a while, it was just like a rubber band snap. Her muscles went lax all of a sudden, and I wasn't expecting it, so I jerked it and it cut her along her sternum.
And now see, when you first started telling us this, you didn't mention anything about her saying that she was going to come here and report that you raped her.
I'm sorry for that. I thought I had told that to you when I was saying, or initially describing what had happened. So that was my mistake, and I apologize for that.
Even at this point in the investigation, when he is clearly at the end of his rope, he's still not able to say, I murdered her, I'm responsible for her death. He just says, I played a major role in it. And that lack of responsibility taking is something that we see time and time again in psychopathic individuals. It's everybody else's fault but theirs, or it's a misunderstanding.
Did you have sex with her after she was dead?
No. Ew. That's not even in anything of my fantasies even. And my fantasies from high school had gone pretty dark, and that wasn't even in there.
You say that's not part of your fantasies. What are your fantasies?
I would rather not answer that. But suffice to say that they were not that dark.
What we know from the investigation is that we have a person who engaged in quite a bit of deviant sexual fantasies, urges, and to some degree, behaviors. No less than 21,000 images found on his computers and various hard drives that would be identified as possible child pornography. You start to look at all these things that are found in Wade's history. We realize this is somebody who has escalating deviant urges that are sadistic in nature. And when you couple that with the impulse control issues, this is a very dangerous individual.
Do you think what you did was wrong?
I'm not going to judge it right or wrong, but I do regret what I did, and I keep wishing that I could go back and do it over again to try and keep that from happening.
You think you should be punished?
Yes and no. Yes, because in my panic, I lied and I destroyed evidence. But no, not for her murder. And I'll accept punishment for her death because it happened and because I played a major part in it. So I don't really believe that I'm guilty of murder.
What caused her death?
me by choking her.
Okay, did you talk to our police dispatcher?
Yes, I did.
Okay. Would it surprise you that exactly what you said is, I would like to confess to a murder? That's exactly what you said, because I heard the recording.
If it's on the recording, then I must have.
Okay, but that's what you did?
I did not murder her.
Again, we see the I know better. Let me discuss the semantics of her death versus murder. There is such a heightened level of grandiosity that's on display here, and also a failure to accept responsibility. So we know that individuals with psychopathy often will find other reasons to justify their behavior. So maybe in his mind, murder is just coldly killing someone without any provocation, and he's still somehow trying to hang on to this idea that he was just defending himself against her.
I just want to give you the opportunity to add whatever you want to.
It's just that overall, I lived my life as not really emotionless as possible, but not very touchy-feely either. It's not that I don't feel emotion, but I keep a very tight rein on it. And at my grandmother's funeral, I probably cried maybe 4 or 5 tears total. But I keep a tight chain on it. Because about the only emotion that I find any sort of value in is loyalty to friends, to family, stuff like that.
It's interesting and really speaks to a lack of self-awareness that he talks about the thing he values most and the emotion he values most is loyalty. He talks about to friends, and we know from the investigation he really doesn't have any. So what I think he's really talking about is loyalty to himself. He's betrayed himself. He's told on himself. He didn't handle this the way he thought he would. And any suggestions of regret really seem to be more about the fact that he's gotten caught.
Developing right now, the search tonight for the body of Lee Porter. Her high school friend is sitting behind bars linked to her murder. Christopher Wade turned himself in to Westminster Police last night. Now the suspect is in jail on charges of sexual assault and murder. Police searched his apartment twice and today sectioned off part of a public landfill in connection with the case.
Is there anything that you would like to request right now from us before we go through that process?
I have no other requests to make other than you keep in mind my decision not to lead an overly emotional life.
So in 2022, almost 8 years sort of after being in prison, Christopher Wade decides to write a letter describing the events of what took place on that day when he killed Leah. And it's not sent to anyone in specific, it's just sent to the court. In the letter, he goes into quite a bit of detail about the events that occurred that day that I think are in many ways illustrative of what goes on in the mind of a psychopath in terms of the use of other people. What Wade writes in the letter is that when Leah was there, she went into the bathroom. There was never any episode of doing a tarot reading for her. There was never an episode of her wanting drugs and trying to hold him hostage with a knife.
At 2:17 a.m., the knock came without warning, not loud enough to wake the street, just firm enough to end a life as it had been lived for 23 years. And somewhere across Sydney a light flicked on, a kettle boiled, a radio murmured, unaware that a cold case was about to crawl out of the dark and breathe again. The file had been stamped closed in red ink only hours earlier, a word that felt heavy, almost mocking, because nothing about this case had ever truly closed. Not the questions, not the whispers, Not the empty space left behind in a house that still smelled faintly of dust and old paper, and a perfume that no one could name. It began on a hot night in the summer of 2001, when the city was loud with celebrations and the harbor glimmered like it was trying to distract everyone from something terrible about to happen. The victim was young, ordinary, forgettable in the way most of us are until we're gone, leaving behind a photograph that becomes iconic only because it's all that's left. A smile caught mid-laugh. A street behind them that still exists, still busy, still unaware of what it once witnessed. They left a pub just after midnight, said goodbye to friends, promised to text when they got home. They never did. By morning the phone was dead. By afternoon the silence had started to scream. The scene was discovered by accident, the worst kind of accident, the kind that rewrites a stranger's life forever. A jogger cutting through a back lane, a flash of fabric near a dumpster, the wrong stillness of a human body in a place meant only for trash and shadows. Police tape went up fast, yellow against brick, fluttering like nervous hands. Cameras arrived. Neighbors leaned out of windows, half-dressed, eyes wide. Word spread faster than facts. Murder, stabbing, robbery gone wrong. By sunset, the community was already in shock, and by sunrise the next day, fear had settled in like humidity, thick and impossible to ignore. Detectives worked the scene until their knees ached and their eyes burned. They cataloged cigarette butts that didn't match, footprints smudged by time and rain. A broken watch stopped at 12:43. No guolit. No kiss. The phone was gone. There were marks that suggested a struggle, but nothing that pointed cleanly to a suspect. No witnesses willing to say they saw anything more than a shadow, a sound, a feeling that something wasn't right. In a city full of CCTV, the cameras nearby had been down for maintenance. A coincidence so cruel it sounded like fiction. The victim's name filled the papers for a week, then 2, then a month. Candlelight vigils burned low. Parents hugged their children tighter. A reward was announced, numbers climbing as hope fell. Tips flooded in, then slowed to a trickle, then dried up entirely. An ex-partner questioned. A co-worker with a temper. A stranger seen loitering days earlier. All dead ends. Every lead dissolved under scrutiny, every theory collapsed into maybe, into what if, into nothing that could stand up in court. The case grew cold the way bodies do, gradually, quietly, until no one notices the exact moment the warmth is gone. Years passed. Detectives retired. Files were boxed and moved, then moved again. The street where it happened was repainted, renamed, redeveloped. New bars opened. New faces laughed on the same corner where blood had once pooled and soaked into concrete that no amount of cleaning could ever truly purify. The family aged around a wound that never closed. Birthdays were marked by absence. Holidays carried an extra chair, an extra silence. The cold case became a cautionary tale, a whispered reference, a reminder that sometimes justice just doesn't come. But cold cases have a way of haunting the people who touched them first. A detail that never sat right. A statement that felt rehearsed. A timeline that bent under pressure. In 2018, a young analyst, barely born when the murder happened, pulled the file from the archive and started reading. Not with nostalgia, but with fresh eyes and a computer that could see patterns humans missed. Old evidence was retested. Fibers re-examined. A partial DNA profile, once useless, was run through a database that hadn't existed back then. It didn't hit immediately. It never does. But it nudged something loose. The break didn't come with sirens or a press conference. It came with a name whispered across a desk. A match so distant it was almost insulting. A relative of a relative. A genetic breadcrumb leading nowhere and everywhere at once. Weeks turned into months of quiet work. Bins were searched. Coffee cups collected. Cigarette filters lifted from gutters in the dead of night. A life was watched without knowing it was under a microscope. Every move catalogued. Every habit noted. The suspect was ordinary, boring, even the kind of person no one remembers at a party, the kind who blends into the background of a city that rewards anonymity. And still doubt lingered. The evidence was circumstantial. The timeline messy. Memories unreliable after 2 decades. Prosecutors hesitated. Detectives argued. The family was told nothing, then everything, then nothing again. Hope is a dangerous thing in a cold case. It rises fast and crashes hard. But then another piece slid into place, small but devastating. A witness who had moved interstate, who had stayed silent out of fear, who finally decided they couldn't carry it anymore. Their statement didn't solve everything, but it changed the shape of the story, turned shadows into silhouettes. By the time the warrant was signed, it was already night. The arrest team moved quietly, aware of the weight of what they were about to do. This wasn't just a suspect. This was time itself being challenged, the idea that you can outrun the past finally put to the test. When the door opened, there was no dramatic chase, no resistance. Just confusion. Shock. A life interrupted by words that hadn't been spoken in over 20 years. You are under arrest. For murder. News broke before dawn. Phones buzzed. Headlines screamed. Sydney woke up to a name they didn't recognize tied to a crime they hadn't forgotten. A late-night arrest shocks the nation, they said. And for once it wasn't hyperbole. Talkback radio lit up. Social media filled with theories, anger, relief, disbelief. How could it take so long? How could someone live a normal life with this hanging over them? How many other cold cases were waiting, silent and patient, for the right moment to strike back? In a small house far from the city, the family sat together as the sun rose, listening to the same report on repeat, afraid to turn it off, afraid it might disappear if they did. Closed, the police said. Solved. Words that felt unreal in their mouths. Words that didn't bring anyone back. Didn't answer every question. Didn't erase the years of not knowing. Outside, the world kept moving, cars passed, neighbors walked dogs. A new day began like any other. But somewhere deep beneath the noise, something old had shifted, and the cold case that had defined a generation was no longer sleeping, no longer silent, and the echo of that knock at 2:17 a.m. was still rippling outward, touching everyone who had ever wondered if the truth would ever come. The hours after the arrest didn't feel like victory. They felt like suspension, like the city itself was holding its breath, waiting to see if this was truth or just another cruel turn in a story that had already taken too much. Inside the station, fluorescent lights hummed over chip desks and old posters warning about silence and rights, and the suspect sat alone for a long time, hands folded, eyes fixed on a spot no one else could see. 23 years collapsed into that room. But time didn't behave the way anyone expected. It didn't rush. It dragged. Every minute stretched, thick with the knowledge that one wrong move could unravel everything. Detectives approached carefully, voices measured, questions precise. They didn't start with the night of the murder. They never do. They started with childhood, jobs, addresses, relationships, building a map of a life that, on paper, looked painfully ordinary. The suspect answered calmly, almost politely, correcting small details, asking for water, glancing at the clock. When the year 2001 finally surfaced, it did so gently, like a test, a toe dipped into cold water. Where were you living then? Who were you seeing? Do you remember that street? A pause. Not long enough to be obvious. Just long enough to be noticed. Outside the room, senior officers watched through glass, replaying old interviews in their minds, comparing this cadence, this posture, to the ghosts of past suspects who had gone nowhere. They had been here before, felt this cautious optimism before, and they knew better than to trust it. The evidence was still fragile. DNA that spoke in probabilities, not certainties. A witness statement warped by time and guilt. A timeline that depended on a memory of a bus that may or may not have been late. This was the knife's edge every cold case balanced on, the space between closure and collapse. The media didn't wait. They never do. By midday, reporters were camped outside the station, microphones ready, faces rehearsed into concern. They called it a breakthrough, a bombshell, the end of a long nightmare. They spoke about justice as if it were already delivered, neatly wrapped and stamped. But inside, the investigators knew better. They knew that the real work had only just begun, that this was the most dangerous moment, when pressure could force mistakes, when a single inconsistency could be magnified into reasonable doubt. Forensic teams reopened evidence that had been sealed for decades. Boxes were unlatched. Bags were opened. The smell of old paper and plastic filled the lab, a scent that meant unfinished business. They re-examined fibers found on clothing, trace elements once dismissed as contamination, a smear that could have come from anywhere or nowhere. Technology had moved on, but evidence hadn't changed. It waited patiently, indifferent to human urgency. Some tests confirmed what they hoped. Others complicated the picture, introducing new questions no one had prepared to answer. The witness was brought back in, older now, hands shaking as they signed forms and swore oaths. They repeated their story, then repeated it again, each time a little different, each time weighed against transcripts from years ago. Trauma distorts time. Fear edits memory. The defense would tear this apart. The detectives knew that, and they braced themselves, asking the same questions from different angles, searching for the core that hadn't shifted. There was one detail that never changed, one image that remained sharp. A voice in the dark, low and urgent, saying something that had seemed meaningless then, but now felt like a fingerprint. The suspect was charged just before midnight. The words read aloud in a courtroom that felt too small for the moment. Murder. A single word that landed heavy, echoing off wood and stone. The accused showed little reaction, a tightening of the jaw, a blink held half a second too long. Outside, cameras flashed, capturing an image that would run on front pages by morning. A face frozen in the worst instant of its life. Closed, the headlines repeated. Cold case closed. As if saying it often enough could make it true. In the days that followed, cracks began to show. An alibi surfaced, thin but persistent, supported by a receipt, a bank record, a memory from someone who had nothing to gain by lying. It didn't clear the suspect, but it muddied the water. Online forums exploded, armchair detectives dissecting timelines, comparing maps, accusing police of tunnel vision. The family stayed silent, retreating from cameras, unwilling to trade one kind of pain for another. They had learned the cost of hope. Inside the prosecution's office, strategy meetings ran late into the night. How much to reveal? When to push? When to hold back? The case was strong enough to move forward, weak enough to fail spectacularly if mishandled. There was talk of a plea, floated carefully, rejected just as quietly. The suspect maintained innocence, a phrase that sounded rehearsed to some, sincere to others. In cold cases, truth often wears many faces, and none of them are simple. As the preliminary hearing approached, an unexpected development sent a ripple through the team. A piece of evidence thought lost had been found misfiled in a secondary archive, a notebook from the original lead detective, long deceased. Inside were scribbles, shorthand, half-formed theories never followed up on. One name appeared repeatedly, not the current suspects, but another, someone who had been questioned once and then dismissed. The reasons were unclear. The timing was inconvenient. The implications were explosive. The notebook forced a reckoning. Had they missed something all those years ago? Had the pressure to close the case now blinded them to old mistakes? Some argued it was irrelevant, a relic of outdated thinking. Others felt a chill, the sense that the case was resisting resolution, pushing back against being forced into a shape it didn't want. They tracked the name down. The person was still alive. Still in Sydney. Still claiming they had nothing to hide. Meanwhile, the suspects sat in remand, days blurring together. The world reduced to routines and waiting. Letters arrived, some hateful, some supportive, all intrusive. Their past was dissected publicly. Old photos dragged into the light. Moments reinterpreted with the benefit of hindsight and suspicion. Friends distanced themselves. Employers released statements. A life was being erased in real time, replaced by a narrative no one could control. The first court appearance was brief, procedural, but the atmosphere was electric. Every word was recorded, every gesture scrutinized. The defense raised concerns about the integrity of the evidence, about the influence of media coverage, about the reliability of decades-old memories. The judge listened impassively, setting dates, reminding everyone that this was not a trial by headline. Outside, the crowd argued anyway, justice versus caution, closure versus truth. As weeks turned into months, the initial shock faded, replaced by a quieter, more dangerous emotion, uncertainty. The phrase cold case closed began to sound premature, even reckless. Investigators followed the lead from the notebook, uncovering coincidences they couldn't ignore, movements that overlapped, opportunities that aligned uncomfortably well with the night of the murder. It didn't exonerate the accused. It didn't condemn the other man. It complicated everything. Late one evening, as rain streaked the windows of the station, a senior detective sat alone with the original case file spread across the desk. reading it the way you read a confession, searching for the line where everything went wrong. They realized then what this case had always been about, not just a single act of violence, but the accumulation of small failures, missed chances, human limits stretched across decades. Cold cases don't stay cold because no one cares. They stay cold because the truth is rarely clean, rarely eager to be found. Outside, Sydney moved on, restless, impatient, hungry for an ending. But inside the investigation, the story was still unfolding, resisting neat conclusions, pulling at threads that led in different directions. The arrest had shocked the nation, yes, but shock fades. What remained was doubt, heavy and unresolved, and the growing awareness that closing a case doesn't always mean closing the wound, and that sometimes the most unsettling part of a mystery is not that it went unsolved for so long, but that even now, with everything laid bare, the darkness was still very much alive. The doubt didn't announce itself loudly, it seeped in through the cracks, through late-night conversations and half-finished coffees, through the way detectives stopped using the word solved and started saying active again, a quiet downgrade that carried enormous weight. Files multiplied on desks, timelines were redrawn, pins moved across maps that had already been rearranged a dozen times. The notebook from the original lead detective became a kind of forbidden object, passed hand to hand, its pages studied like scripture, every underline and margin note treated as intentional, even the messy ones that might have meant nothing at all. The name inside it refused to fade. Not a suspect, not officially, just a presence that had been brushed past too quickly in 2001, when resources were thin and pressure was thick. Back then, the focus had been speed, reassurance, the need to show a shaken city that control still existed. Now speed was the enemy. Now every assumption was dangerous. They pulled old interview tapes, listened to voices that sounded younger, more certain, replayed statements that had been summarized instead of transcribed. In one recording, a question cut off too soon. In another, a pause that should have been filled but wasn't. Small things, but cold cases are built from small things. The second man was brought in quietly, no cameras, no headlines, just a phone call and a request to talk. He arrived with a lawyer, confident, relaxed, almost amused by the idea that this was happening now. He answered questions easily, his story polished by time, his alibi supported by people who remembered him vaguely, fondly. He had changed jobs, moved houses, raised children. There was no obvious motive, no dramatic history, nothing that screamed danger. And yet the overlap was undeniable. He had been nearby that night. Closer than he had ever admitted. Close enough to matter. As the investigation widened, the original suspect's case didn't collapse, but it wobbled. New forensic results came back inconclusive, not exculpatory, but not the solid ground prosecutors had hoped for. The DNA profile still pointed in one direction, but the margin for interpretation grew wider with every new variable. Defense filings grew thicker, sharper, poking at chain of custody, at contamination risks, at the reliability of late-discovered evidence. The phrase reasonable doubt appeared more often, spoken softly, confidently, like a spell. The media sensed blood in the water. The narrative shifted from triumph to tension, from solved to spiraling. Opinion pieces questioned police competence, praised perseverance, accused everyone of everything. Talkback callers argued over innocence and guilt, as if they were discussing sports teams. The victims' names surfaced again, dragged back into the cycle, their image reprinted, their life reduced once more to a symbol. The family issued a brief statement asking for patience, for care, for respect. It was largely ignored. Inside the courthouse, procedural hearings stretched on, dry and technical, but beneath them ran a current of anxiety. Judges weighed motions. Lawyers postured. Dates were set, adjourned, reset. The accused sat through it all expressionless, while the possibility of freedom and the threat of life imprisonment hung in the balance. Across the aisle, the second man watched from a distance, not charged, not named publicly, but increasingly aware that the past was circling him too. A new witness emerged unexpectedly, not from the street or the pub or the neighborhood, but from inside the system itself. A retired officer, long removed from the job, came forward after seeing the news, haunted by a memory that had bothered him for years. He recalled pressure from above, subtle but unmistakable, to narrow focus, to prioritize certain leads over others. He didn't claim corruption, just urgency. the kind that compresses judgment and leaves blind spots in its wake. His testimony was vague, careful, but it added to the sense that something had been lost early on and never fully recovered. The prosecution faced a choice that felt impossible: push forward and risk a spectacular failure that could poison the case forever, or step back, reassess, and invite accusations of incompetence and collapse. Behind closed doors, arguments flared. Careers were on the line now, reputations tethered to decisions made in conference rooms long after midnight. Cold cases don't just test evidence, they test resolve. Meanwhile, the community's patience thinned. Memorials appeared again at the site of the crime, fresh flowers placed beside faded ones, notes tucked into cracks in the wall. Strangers stood there staring, trying to feel something definitive, something that would tell them what to believe. Instead, they felt the same unease that had lingered for decades, the sense that the truth was close but deliberately evasive, like a shape just beyond the reach of light. The original case file was digitized completely, every page scanned, every photo enhanced. Analysts ran new models, searching for patterns in movements, in timing, in behavior. One pattern stood out, not dramatic but consistent. A 15-minute window that had never been fully explained, a gap in both men's accounts, small enough to be overlooked, large enough to contain everything. It became the focal point, the hinge on which the entire case seemed to swing. Late one night, a junior detective noticed something almost embarrassing in its simplicity. A public transport schedule from 2001, archived online, contradicted a long-held assumption about travel times. The bus route thought impossible was, in fact, feasible. The gap shrank, then shifted, then aligned with a piece of CCTV footage once dismissed as irrelevant, a blurry figure crossing a street at the edge of the frame. The image was enhanced, sharpened, debated endlessly. It was still unclear, still arguable, but it refused to be ignored now. The second man was interviewed again, this time with more urgency. His confidence cracked slightly, not enough to call it panic, but enough to register. He corrected himself mid-sentence. He asked what evidence they had. He leaned back, then forward, then crossed his arms. Body language isn't proof, but in a case starved of certainties, everything was noted. When he left, the room felt colder. At the same time, pressure mounted to either commit fully to the prosecution or pull back entirely. The term mistrial began to surface in whispered conversations. So did the unthinkable possibility of withdrawing charges. The family was briefed privately, faces drawn, eyes tired. They had waited too long to be prepared for another reversal, another chapter of uncertainty. And yet, they listened because listening was all they had ever been able to do. As the trial date approached, the city braced itself again. Not for closure this time, but for conflict. Two possible truths stood side by side, each incomplete, each plausible, each devastating in its own way. The cold case that had once seemed resolved now threatened to fracture, to expose not just one night of violence, but an entire system's struggle with time, memory, and human error. In the end, no announcement was made, no dramatic declaration to satisfy the hunger for answers. What emerged instead was a quieter realization, spreading slowly through the investigation like a chill. This case might not be about identifying a single monster, but about confronting the uncomfortable possibility that the truth had been splintered from the very beginning, divided between moments, people, decisions that could never be fully undone. And as the city waited, restless and divided, the shadow of 2001 stretched forward once more, reminding everyone that some mysteries don't deepen with time. They harden, resisting every attempt to break them open, daring anyone to claim with certainty that they finally know what happened in the dark. The hardening of the mystery changed the temperature of everything. Conversations became clipped, decisions slowed. Where there had once been momentum, there was now friction, an awareness that every step forward might also be a step toward irreversible damage. The prosecution asked for time, more time than anyone wanted to hear, and the judge granted it with a warning that patience was not infinite. Outside the courthouse, rain fell in thin, relentless sheets, blurring the city into streaks of gray, as if Sydney itself were trying to erase sharp edges, trying to soften a story that refused to be softened. Behind closed doors, the case fractured into competing versions of reality. One path led forward toward trial, toward putting a single man in the center of the frame and daring 12 jurors to see what investigators saw. The other path bent sideways toward reinvestigation, toward admitting publicly that certainty had been premature, that the word closed had been spoken too soon. Neither option felt like justice. Both felt like risk. The evidence board was rebuilt from scratch. Not rearranged, not refined, but stripped bare and reconstructed. Each item questioned as if it were new. Why had this fiber mattered? Why had that witness been discounted? Why had this lead been followed while another had quietly died? There were no satisfying answers, only explanations that sounded thinner each time they were repeated. The case had been shaped by the limitations of its era, by the assumptions of people who believed they were doing the right thing with what they had. That knowledge didn't absolve anyone. It only complicated the blame. The first suspect's legal team pressed harder now, sensing weakness. Motions multiplied. Requests for exclusion, for dismissal, for sanctions. They painted a picture of tunnel vision, of a police force so eager for resolution that it had bent evidence into compliance. They highlighted the notebook, the second name, the shifting timelines. In court, they spoke calmly, methodically, letting the accumulation of doubt do the work for them. The accused watched, eyes fixed forward. A man suspended between two possible futures, both terrifying in different ways. The second man remained uncharged, but no longer untouched. Surveillance increased. Financial records were reviewed. Old phone logs were revisited, grainy and incomplete, but still capable of telling stories. He felt it, the pressure, the sense of being watched, and it began to change him. Friends noticed irritability. Family noticed distance. He hired his own legal counsel, a move that spoke volumes without saying a word. Innocent people lawyer up too, everyone knew that, but in a case like this, perception was as powerful as fact. A forensic breakthrough was promised, hinted at, then quietly downgraded. A lab result that had been expected to clarify only deepened ambiguity, introducing the possibility of secondary transfer, of contamination so old it couldn't be traced. The DNA that had once felt like an anchor now behaved more like fog, obscuring rather than illuminating. Experts disagreed openly, their confidence inversely proportional to their distance from the evidence. The jury pool, already skeptical, grew more confused with every explanation. In the victim's family home, time moved differently. News arrived in fragments, filtered through briefings and headlines, and the well-meaning messages of people who didn't know what to say. They replayed memories instead, the sound of laughter, the weight of a presence that had once filled rooms. Justice, when imagined, had always been simple. A name, a verdict, an ending. Now it looked like paperwork and delays and arguments about procedure. Now it looked like the possibility that there might never be a single moment where it all made sense. The media turned the uncertainty into spectacle. Graphics compared suspects. Timelines were animated, color-coded, simplified until they barely resembled reality. Pundits argued late into the night, voices raised, certainty manufactured for entertainment. The phrase "cold case closed" was replayed ironically, a caption beneath stories about doubt and delay. Trust eroded, not just in this investigation, but in the idea that truth once lost could always be recovered. Then, quietly, another detail surfaced, almost overlooked amid the noise. A call log entry from the early hours of the morning in 2001, previously dismissed as a wrong number, resurfaced during a deeper audit. It was short, seconds long, placed from a public phone that no longer existed. At the time it had gone nowhere. Now, paired with new mapping software and reconstructed signal ranges, it suggested proximity, a physical closeness that tightened the net around the second man. Not proof, never proof, but enough to demand attention. Detectives followed the thread cautiously, aware of how many times the case had punished haste. They traced the phone, the booth, the nearby businesses that had operated that night. One remained, renovated but standing, its old security logs long gone, its staff scattered. They found one former employee, then another. Most remembered nothing. One remembered something small. A man pacing, agitated, using the phone, slamming the receiver down. No face. No name. Just a feeling. In a stronger case it would have meant nothing. Here it meant everything. The prosecution reevaluated again. The weight of uncertainty pressed down, flattening options. They could amend charges, expand the scope, delay further. Each choice carried consequences measured not just in legal terms, but in public trust and private grief. The judge demanded clarity. So did the defense. So did a city tired of waiting. As deadlines approached, a meeting was called that few outside the room would ever know about. Senior officials, legal advisors, investigators who had lived with the case for years sat around a table littered with files and cold coffee. They spoke candidly without posturing, about what they knew and what they didn't. About the risk of letting a guilty person walk. About the horror of imprisoning the wrong one. About the possibility that the truth did not belong cleanly to either suspect, that something more complex had happened in the dark. When the meeting ended, there was no consensus, only a shared understanding that whatever came next would define not just this case, but careers, institutions, legacies. The decision would not feel like closure. It would feel like a compromise with reality. Word reached the defense first, then the media, then the family. The prosecution was considering its position. Not withdrawing. Not advancing. Considering. The announcement landed like a held note, unresolved, vibrating with implication. Commentators speculated wildly. Social media erupted again. The city leaned forward, waiting for a fall that did not come. In the space between action and inaction, the cold case existed in a strange half-life, neither solved nor unsolved, neither past nor present. It had escaped the neat boundaries everyone wanted to impose on it, revealing instead the uncomfortable truth beneath all long-buried crimes, that time does not clarify everything, that some answers degrade as years pass, and that the search for justice can sometimes expose how fragile certainty really is. And as night settled over Sydney once more, the same streets glowing under the same lights that had watched everything happen all those years ago, the case lingered heavy and unresolved, a reminder that darkness doesn't always retreat when confronted, and that some stories resist endings not because they are unsolvable, but because the cost of solving them may be more than anyone is willing to pay. The consideration dragged on, days stretching into weeks, each one adding weight to a case already bent under its own history. Silence became its own kind of statement. No press conferences. No definitive filings. Just the low hum of anticipation. The sense that something irreversible was being shaped behind doors that never quite closed. For the first suspect, time in remand slowed to a crawl, measured in routines and rumors, in headlines smuggled in by guards who pretended not to read them. For the second man, time accelerated, every ring of the phone a jolt, every knock an echo of possibility. Inside the prosecution's office, drafts were written and discarded, arguments constructed, then dismantled. One version leaned hard on DNA and proximity, on the idea that science, even imperfect, could still anchor a jury's belief. Another version widened the lens, introduced uncertainty as context rather than weakness, trusting that a narrative of persistence and evolving truth might resonate. Neither felt safe. Both felt like gambles with stakes too high to articulate. The judge's patience thinned. A deadline was set, firm this time, a line drawn in legal ink. Advance or withdraw. Clarify or concede. The system demanded an answer, indifferent to the emotional debris scattered in its path. On talkback radio, callers argued about courage and cowardice, about whether justice meant action at any cost or restraint in the face of doubt. No one agreed. Everyone felt entitled to an ending. The family was called in again, ushered into a quiet room with neutral walls and a box of tissues that no one touched. They listened as options were laid out carefully, each sentence balanced, each implication softened. Proceed and risk acquittal. Pause and risk losing momentum forever. Amend charges and invite chaos. There were no good choices, only different shapes of pain. They asked one question, the same one they had asked for over 2 decades. Do you know what happened? The answer still was no. A leak hit the papers 2 days later. Not dramatic, just enough to inflame speculation. An unnamed source suggested the prosecution was divided, that internal disagreements were threatening the case. The reaction was immediate. Confidence dropped. Anger rose. The phrase mishandled began to trend, followed closely by miscarriage of justice. For investigators who had given years of their lives to this file, it felt like being tried in public without a defense. Under that pressure, the second man made a move of his own. Through his lawyer, he offered to cooperate further, to answer questions he had previously deflected, to clarify timelines, to provide access to records he had insisted were irrelevant. It was framed as goodwill, as a desire to clear his name. It was also strategic, a way to control narrative, to appear transparent before suspicion could harden into accusation. Detectives agreed, wary but curious. The interview lasted hours. He spoke more freely this time, less guarded, volunteering details unprompted. He admitted to being closer to the area than he had said before, blamed faulty memory, the fog of years. He acknowledged using a public phone that night, but insisted it was unrelated, a call to a friend whose number he could no longer remember. When pressed, his frustration flared, then receded. He wanted to help, he said. He wanted this to end. It was impossible to tell whether that was a truth or a tactic. The call became the focal point. Analysts worked backwards, reconstructing possibilities, cross-referencing sparse data with modern models. The range narrowed. The window tightened. The call could have been made by him. It could also have been made by dozens of others. Probability refused to solidify into certainty. Still, the pressure shifted. For the first time, the weight of the case was no longer resting almost entirely on one set of shoulders. The prosecution's decision came quietly, delivered in a filing that avoided dramatic language. They would proceed, but with amendments. The scope of evidence would expand. The narrative would acknowledge complexity. The defense pounced immediately, calling it an admission of weakness, a desperate attempt to salvage a broken case. The judge allowed it, noting that justice was not served by pretending simplicity where none existed. Trial preparations resumed with a different energy now, less triumphant, more defensive. Jury consultants were brought in. Arguments were stress-tested. Every exhibit was scrutinized not just for what it showed, but for how it could be misunderstood. The fear was no longer just acquittal. It was confusion. A jury lost in competing theories, paralyzed by doubt. When the trial finally began, the courtroom was packed, tension palpable. Opening statements avoided absolutes. The prosecution spoke of a night that went wrong, of actions that left irreversible consequences, of evidence that pointed, if imperfectly, toward responsibility. The defense spoke of assumptions, of gaps filled by imagination, of a system so eager for closure that it had mistaken accumulation for proof. The second man hovered at the edges of the story, unnamed but present, a shadow complicating every claim. Witnesses took the stand, some confident, some fragile. Memories wavered. Timelines bent under cross-examination. Experts contradicted each other politely, then sharply. The DNA was explained, then questioned, then explained again. Jurors scribbled notes, brows furrowed, eyes darting between exhibits and faces. It was not the clean reckoning the city had been promised. It was messy, human, unsatisfying. Outside, reactions fractured. Some clung to belief, convinced that persistence itself was proof. Others recoiled, seeing in the proceedings a warning about the limits of hindsight. The family attended every day, faces set, absorbing testimony like a second trauma. They did not look at the accused. They looked at the floor, at the walls, at anything that wasn't the embodiment of 23 years of waiting. As the trial moved toward its end, the sense of inevitability everyone had expected never arrived. Instead, there was only tension, stretched thin, vibrating. Closing arguments landed without thunder. The jury was sent away with instructions heavy on caution, on the burden of proof, on the difference between suspicion and certainty. Then the waiting began again. Days passed. Then more. The city watched the courthouse steps as if they might speak. When the jury finally returned, the atmosphere was brittle, ready to shatter. The verdict, when it came, was careful, measured, devastating in its ambiguity. Not guilty. The words echoed, then dissolved into noise. Gasps. Murmurs. Cameras flashing. The accused exhaled, shoulders dropping. A life redirected in an instant. The family remained still, absorbing the impact of an outcome they had been warned about but never truly believed would happen. Outside, reactions erupted, anger and resignation colliding in real time. The cold case was not reopened. It was not resolved. It settled into a new, uneasy state, altered but unresolved, its questions sharper now for having been asked in public. The second man was never charged. The investigation remained technically active, but momentum drained away, the system exhausted by its own effort. In the weeks that followed, Sydney moved on, as cities always do. New stories replaced old ones. Headlines faded, but beneath the surface something lingered. A sense that the truth had brushed past, close enough to feel, but had never quite been grasped. The case remained a warning, a scar, a reminder that some nights never end cleanly, that some answers resist even the most determined pursuit, and that in the aftermath of shock and spectacle, what remains is not closure, but the quiet, enduring weight of not knowing. Acquittal did not bring silence. It brought a different kind of noise, lower, constant, the sound of something unfinished grinding on. The courthouse emptied, cameras packed away. But the case did not disperse with the crowd. It followed people home, into cars, into kitchens where the television stayed on long after midnight, replaying the same images, the same phrases, the same careful explanation of why not guilty did not mean innocent, why doubt had won without answering anything at all. For the man who walked free, relief came tangled with fear. Freedom was real but fragile, conditional in ways no verdict could undo. His name lingered online, searchable, attached forever to the word murder, no matter how many times the judge had said acquitted. Old friends kept their distance. New ones never quite trusted him. Every ordinary interaction carried an edge, the sense that someone somewhere was still deciding what he was. Cold cases don't release their suspects cleanly. They mark them. For investigators, the verdict landed like a bruise you don't feel until hours later. Officially, they respected the jury's decision. Unofficially, they replayed every moment, every call they might have made differently, every piece of evidence they might have framed another way. The case room stayed open longer than it needed to, lights burning late as if vigilance alone could summon clarity. Some detectives asked to be reassigned. Others couldn't let go, returning to the file again and again, unable to accept that this was the end of the road. The second man felt the shift immediately. With the spotlight dimmed, scrutiny softened, but it did not disappear. If anything, it became more personal, more private. He told people the ordeal was over, that the system had spoken. He tried to sound convincing. Yet he changed routines, avoided certain streets, flinched at unfamiliar faces. Guilt and innocence can produce similar behaviors, and in the absence of proof, interpretation filled the vacuum. The prosecution released a brief statement acknowledging the outcome and affirming their commitment to justice. Said nothing about next steps. Behind the scenes, discussions continued, quieter now, less hopeful. Could the case be refiled? Should it be? Was there anything left to test, to chase, to reimagine? The answer, slowly and reluctantly, settled into place. Not enough. Not anymore. Evidence was returned to storage. Some items, too degraded to be useful, were marked for destruction, a bureaucratic act that felt uncomfortably final. The notebook went back into the archive, its pages no less troubling for having failed to change the outcome. The public phone booth that had become so important existed now only in maps and memory. Another ghost in a city full of them. The family withdrew from public view. They declined interviews. They stopped answering calls. In private, they tried to rebuild routines that had been repeatedly dismantled by hope and disappointment. Grief shifted shape again, from anticipation to resignation, from the sharp pain of waiting to the dull ache of permanence. They argued, they comforted each other, they sat in silence. Closure had been promised so many times it had lost meaning. What they wanted now was distance. Years have a way of smoothing over sharp edges, but they don't erase. The case became a reference point, cited in law schools and police training seminars as a lesson in complexity, in the dangers of certainty, in the limits of forensic promise. Cold case closed was used ironically now, a cautionary headline rather than a celebration. New detectives learned the story before they ever touched a file, warned about the cost of time, the fragility of memory. Occasionally a tip still came in. A late-night email, an anonymous call, someone claiming they knew something or had always known something, or had dreamed something that felt real enough to report. Each was logged. Each was assessed. None led anywhere solid. The system responded as it always does, methodical, restrained, unwilling to be embarrassed again by optimism. The city itself absorbed the story into its fabric. The lane where it happened was repaved. New murals went up. A cafe opened where an alley once stood, bright and inviting, its customers unaware of what the ground beneath them had witnessed. Sometimes someone would pause there, uncertain why the place felt heavy, why a chill passed through them despite the sun. They would shake it off and move on. Every anniversary, a small cluster of flowers appeared anyway, placed by hands that remembered. No press. No speeches. Just a quiet acknowledgement that something unresolved still mattered. Passers-by glanced, curious, then continued on, the moment already slipping behind them. Cold cases do not stay alive because of evidence alone. They persist because of absence, because of the human refusal to accept that some questions will never be answered. This one lived on in that space between what was known and what could never be proven, between suspicion and certainty, between justice and the illusion of it. And somewhere in the private hours of the night, when distractions fell away and the city's noise thinned to a distant hum, there were people who replayed that summer night in 2001, not as it had been recorded, but as it might have been. Different choices. Different paths. A moment interrupted. The knock that came at 2:17 a.m. echoing forward and backward in time, unanswered. The case file remained open in name only, a technicality that satisfied no one. It sat on a shelf among others like it. Stories of violence that refused resolution. Reminders that even in an age of data and databases, some truths remained stubbornly out of reach. And as Sydney slept, lights blinking across the harbor, the cold case lingered, not solved, not closed, but awake, waiting, a quiet presence that asked nothing and accused everyone, daring anyone to say with confidence that they finally knew how it ended. Time didn't heal the case, it diluted it, thinning the outrage, spreading the questions wider until they became part of the background noise of the city. A year passed, then another, and the acquittal settled into the record like sediment, heavy and unmoving. Officially, nothing was happening. Unofficially, the case never fully went to sleep. It breathed quietly inside databases, inside memories, inside the minds of people who had been too close to forget. A new detective found the file the way these things often happen, by accident. A routine audit. A mislabeled box. A digital cross-reference that surfaced the name again, flagged not by intent but by algorithm. He hadn't lived in Sydney in 2001. He didn't remember the headlines, the vigils, the early certainty. To him, the case wasn't sacred. It wasn't personal. It was data, raw and unresolved, and that distance gave him a freedom others no longer had. He read everything. Not quickly, not selectively, but obsessively, as if the order itself might reveal something. He noticed how language shifted over time, how early reports were confident, almost casual, and later ones hedged, softened, protected themselves. He noticed what wasn't there. Questions never asked. Assumptions never challenged. One particular absence began to bother him, a detail referenced indirectly several times but never addressed head-on. A third presence, unnamed, unidentified, dismissed early as irrelevant. He didn't announce his interest. He didn't reopen anything formally. He started with side paths, with records that had nothing to do with murder on their own. Noise complaints. Minor assaults. Drunk and disorderly reports from the surrounding area in the months before and after the crime. Patterns emerged slowly, the way they always do when you're not looking for them too hard. A cluster of incidents. A description repeated with small variations. A man who argued loudly, who moved unpredictably, who vanished whenever police arrived. The description was vague enough to be useless in court, but specific enough to feel familiar. Height. Build. A distinctive gait noted more than once. A scar mentioned by a witness who couldn't remember where she'd seen him, only that she didn't like the way he watched people. The detective cross-referenced the details with hospital admissions, with shelter logs, with names that appeared once and never again. One matched just enough to stand out. The man had died years earlier. An overdose. No investigation beyond the necessary. No family to push for answers. He had lived transiently, worked sporadically, existed mostly on the edges of records and memory. On the night of the murder, he had been in the area. Not proven. Not logged. But likely. He had a history of violence that escalated under stress. He had vanished from police radars shortly after 2001, reappearing briefly in another city before disappearing for good. The detective felt the familiar pull, the dangerous one, the urge to connect dots that wanted to be connected. He resisted it, slowed himself down, forced every assumption to justify itself. Still, the shape refused to go away. This man fit into the gaps too neatly, occupying spaces the other suspects had never fully filled. He wasn't a solution. He was a complication, and complications were what this case seemed to feed on. He brought his findings to a supervisor carefully, without conclusions. The response was polite, distant. The case was sensitive. The case was exhausted. The case had already taken enough from the department. There was no appetite for reopening wounds that couldn't be stitched closed. Especially not for a suspect who could never be questioned, never charged, never defended. The detective understood the logic. He didn't accept it. He continued quietly, off the clock, driven less by hope than by irritation. He tracked the dead man's movements as best he could, piecing together a life from fragments. He found a former acquaintance, then another, people who remembered him only vaguely, usually with discomfort. They described volatility, paranoia, bursts of charm followed by long silences. One mentioned a knife obsession, laughed it off as exaggeration, then stopped laughing when asked about dates. Nothing he found could change the verdict. Nothing could name a killer with certainty. But together, the fragments formed an outline that refused to be ignored. A presence that explained the randomness, the lack of motive, the brutality without theft. The way the crime seemed both personal and impersonal at once. It was a theory, nothing more, and the detective knew better than to fall in love with theories. Still, he documented everything, filed it where it couldn't be lost again. Word leaked not to the media but internally. Whispers moved through the department. Some dismissed it as distraction, a way for a young detective to make his mark on a famous case. Others felt a familiar unease, the sense that the truth might have slipped through fingers already scarred from gripping too tightly. No action was taken. No statements issued. The case remained unchanged on paper. The family was never told. Not officially. There was no mechanism for it. No obligation to share speculation that could offer neither justice nor closure. And yet, somehow they heard anyway, through a friend of a friend, a half-formed rumor that there had been another possibility all along. It reopened everything. Anger flared. Then exhaustion. Then a quiet resignation that felt heavier than either. In the years that followed, the story shifted again, subtly the way myths do. The acquitted man faded from the narrative, replaced by ambiguity. The second man became a footnote. The idea of an unknown third presence gained traction in forums and podcasts, debated endlessly by people who had never set foot in Sydney, who consumed the case as entertainment, as puzzle, as proof that truth was always more complex than official stories allowed. The detective eventually moved on. New cases, new pressures. But he kept a copy of his notes, not out of obsession but out of respect. Respect for the idea that even if the system couldn't act, memory still mattered. That acknowledging uncertainty was better than pretending it didn't exist. The cold case lived on in this altered form, no longer anchored to a single suspect or a single theory, but suspended between possibilities, a narrative fractured beyond repair. It became less about who did it and more about how easily answers slip away, how quickly confidence turns to doubt, how justice, once delayed long enough, begins to lose its shape. And somewhere in that space, between official records and unofficial truths, the night in 2001 remained exactly as it had always been. Unchanged. Unrepentant. Waiting. The waiting took on a different quality after that, less urgent, more corrosive, like rust spreading where no one bothered to look anymore. The case stopped being news and became lore. A story you heard late at night, framed as a warning or a riddle depending on who was telling it. Police no longer flinched when the file number came up. They sighed. They knew it. Everyone did. The cold case had outlived its moment and settled into permanence. Then, without ceremony, the past surfaced again in a place no one expected. A redevelopment project on the edge of the city, old warehouses torn down to make room for glass and steel, triggered a routine environmental survey. Soil samples, drainage checks, the usual precautions. In the process, workers uncovered a corroded metal object buried beneath layers of fill, wrapped in plastic that had long since fused to itself. First it was logged as debris. Then someone noticed the shape. The find was handled quietly, deliberately. No sirens. No press. Just a call to a forensic unit that had learned the hard way not to promise anything. The object was a knife, badly degraded. The blade pitted and discolored, the handle cracked. Could have been anything. Could have been nothing. But the location mattered. Less than a kilometer from where the murder had occurred. Close enough to reopen old maps in tired minds. Testing took months. There was no usable DNA, no miracle reversal of time. What they did find was more frustrating, more ambiguous. Trace elements consistent with the victim's injuries. Manufacturing details that matched a type of knife popular in the late 1990s, sold cheaply, unremarkable. The same kind owned by thousands of people. The same kind mentioned, almost offhandedly, in the detective's notes about the dead man. The department faced a familiar dilemma. The evidence was suggestive, not decisive. Enough to reignite debate. Not enough to justify action. They issued a brief statement acknowledging the discovery and its limited relevance. The media did the rest, inflating possibilities, speculating wildly, resurrecting names that had been carefully buried. The phrase "new twist" dominated headlines for a week before exhaustion reclaimed it. Online, the case exploded again. Forums filled with diagrams and theories. Amateur investigators linked the knife to the third presence, to the dead man, to the acquitted suspect, to anyone who fit the shape of a villain. Old photos were enhanced, then enhanced again, faces circled, arrows drawn. Certainty was manufactured from pixels and conviction. It meant nothing. Felt like everything. For the family, the news landed with a dull thud. Not shock. Not hope. Something flatter. They had learned not to climb emotional hills without knowing what waited on the other side. They acknowledged the update in a single sentence through a lawyer and retreated once more. Grief had become procedural. Within the department, arguments resurfaced. Some saw the knife as confirmation that the case had never been fully understood, that something had indeed been missed. Others saw it as coincidence, an artifact of a violent city with a long memory. The younger detective read the reports carefully, comparing corrosion patterns, burial depth, proximity. It didn't prove his theory. It didn't disprove it either. It hovered, stubborn and incomplete. He requested permission to run one final analysis, a synthesis of everything learned after the trial, including the knife, the third presence, the call, the overlapping gaps. The answer came back measured, non-committal. He could write a memo. It would be reviewed. It would not change the case status. He wrote it anyway. The memo was precise, restrained, deliberately cautious. It avoided accusations. It avoided conclusions. It outlined possibilities, dependencies, uncertainties. It read less like an argument and more like a warning. A record, in case someone someday needed to understand how close the truth might have come without ever arriving. Nothing happened. The city absorbed the knife the way it absorbed everything else, briefly, intensely, then not at all. A new scandal replaced it. A new crime demanded attention. The warehouse became a development. The soil was replaced. Whatever had rested there for decades was gone again. Reduced to evidence tags and footnotes. The cold case slipped back into its half-life, changed but not transformed. The acquitted man continued to live quietly, carrying a shadow that never fully lifted. The second man aged, his proximity to the story fading as newer names took its place. The dead man remained dead, his role unproven, his existence reduced to speculation and a handful of lines in a memo few would ever read. And yet something subtle had shifted. The idea that the truth was unknowable gave way to something more unsettling, the sense that it might be knowable, just not actionable. That the pieces, scattered and degraded, might still form a picture if laid out correctly, but that no one had the authority, the will, or the permission to assemble them anymore. In the end, that was the coldest part of the case. Not the violence. Not the years of silence. But the quiet understanding that the story had moved beyond the reach of justice, into a space where it would be remembered, argued over, retold but never resolved. A case not closed by answers but by exhaustion. And somewhere beneath the noise of construction and traffic and progress, beneath the city that refused to stop for any one tragedy, the night in 2001 remained sealed in place, holding its secrets with a patience that outlasted everyone who tried to force them free. Exhaustion has a way of masquerading as acceptance. The city told itself the story was finished because it had no other way to carry it. Files were archived again. This time with a finality that felt administrative rather than moral. The cold case remained technically alive, but only in the way certain buildings remain standing long after they've been abandoned, shells with wiring still humming, lights flickering in rooms no one enters. Years slid past quietly. New detectives replaced old ones. New crimes demanded urgency, clarity, outcomes. The 2001 file was mentioned less and less, referenced only when training manuals warned about evidentiary drift or when journalists needed an example of justice delayed past recognition. It became shorthand for failure without anyone ever agreeing on whose failure it was. The younger detective eventually transferred units. He took nothing official with him, but memory doesn't require permission. The shape of the case stayed with him, the gaps, the patterns that almost aligned. He learned, as all investigators eventually do, that some cases don't end, they simply stop responding. He also learned to recognize the sound of unfinished business, even when everyone else had tuned it out. The first suspect, acquitted and outwardly free, tried to rebuild a life that had been dismantled in public. He moved, changed jobs, changed his appearance, but certain things followed him regardless. Online searches, background checks, awkward pauses in conversation when someone recognized his name but couldn't quite place it. He avoided the city center, avoided late nights, avoided talking about the past entirely. Innocence, even when legally affirmed, did not feel like absolution. The second man grew quieter with age. Where once there had been defensiveness, there was now fatigue. He stopped correcting people when they hinted at the case. He stopped denying anything outright. Silence became his default. Those close to him noticed he drank more, slept less, startled easily. When asked if he worried about the past catching up, he answered honestly. He said it already had. The family marked time in private now. Anniversaries passed without statements. Birthdays went unacknowledged publicly. They no longer searched the internet for updates. They no longer called detectives. They carried the case internally, the way you carry a chronic pain, adapting posture and movement around it without ever forgetting it's there. Closure, they had learned, was a word for other people. Then something unexpected happened. Not dramatic, not cinematic, but unsettling in its mundanity. A routine audit of old hospital records, part of a broader digitization effort, flagged a discrepancy from the early 2000s. An intake form from a public emergency department, time-stamped just hours after the murder, listed an injury that didn't quite fit its explanation. A deep laceration to the hand. The patient had claimed it was a kitchen accident. The location of the cut suggested otherwise. At the time it had meant nothing. Now algorithms notice what people hadn't. The patient's name matched the dead man's. Not conclusively, not perfectly, but enough to raise a question that had never been asked. The record included an address that no longer existed and a doctor's note that mentioned agitation, confusion, and insistence on leaving before full examination. He had refused stitches. He had signed himself out. The discovery circulated cautiously. No alerts. No reopening. Just an internal note added to a growing list of maybes. For some, it confirmed suspicions. For others, it changed nothing. The man was dead. The injury could not be proven to be connected. The knife found years later could not be tied to him definitively. The call log remained ambiguous. The system did what it always does when certainty is unavailable. It documented and moved on. But documentation has weight. It accumulates. It alters the way stories are told, even if it never alters outcomes. Quietly, unofficially, the internal narrative shifted. The focus drifted further from the acquitted man, away from the second suspect, toward a version of events that could never be tested in court. A volatile third presence. An impulsive act. A crime without witnesses and without a living defendant. No one announced this shift. No memo declared it. It existed only in conversations that happened off the record, in the way certain names were no longer spoken with emphasis, in the way others were referenced with a kind of resigned clarity. The truth, if it existed, was now understood as something adjacent to justice, not overlapping with it. The public never fully caught up. Podcasts speculated. Documentaries teased revelations that never quite materialized. Each retelling bent the facts a little further, sharpening villains, smoothing complexity. The case became content stripped of consequence, consumed by people who felt certainty because uncertainty is uncomfortable. The real story, fragmented and unresolved, did not fit neatly into episodes or headlines. On one quiet evening, years after the acquittal, the younger detective stood near the old site, unrecognizable now beneath concrete and light. He didn't stay long. There was nothing to see. Still, he felt the weight of the place, the way certain locations absorb history and refuse to release it. He wondered, not for the first time, whether the case had been unsolvable from the start, not because the truth was hidden, but because it had never been singular. Some crimes are not one decision, one person, one moment. They are intersections. Bad timing. Fractured intent. The wrong people crossing paths at the wrong hour in a city that never notices until it's too late. The system is built to find lines. This case was made of angles. As the years continued their quiet advance, the cold case remained where it had always been, suspended between versions, resistant to certainty. Not a failure in the way people wanted to define it, but a reminder that justice is not a guarantee, that truth is not obligated to reveal itself fully, and that some nights leave behind more questions than answers, no matter how long you stare into them. And beneath it all, untouched by verdicts or theories or time itself, the night in 2001 stayed intact, sealed in darkness, carrying the only version of events that mattered, a version no one would ever hear, and that silence, more than anything else, continued to echo. Silence eventually becomes its own testimony, not loud enough to provoke action, not empty enough to be ignored. It settles into the background like a low-frequency hum, felt more than heard, shaping behavior without ever announcing itself. That was what remained of the case now, a pressure the city no longer named but still responded to, a lesson absorbed without being taught. A decade after the acquittal, the department conducted a quiet internal review, not of the case itself, but of cold case methodology as a whole. New standards, new safeguards, new language about certainty and probability. The 2001 file was cited anonymously, stripped of names, used as an example of convergence risk, of how momentum can masquerade as truth when time has eroded context. No one argued. Everyone understood which case it was. The review changed procedures, not outcomes. Evidence would be handled differently now. Statements recorded differently. Assumptions challenged earlier. It was progress built on absence, improvement drawn from something that could never be fixed. The file remained untouched, but its shadow reshaped everything around it. The younger detective, older now, read the final review summary in his office late one evening. He recognized his own instincts in the language, his own frustrations refined into policy. It should have felt like vindication. It didn't. It felt like an apology written too late, addressed to no one in particular. He closed the document and didn't open the case file again. Across the city, the acquitted man watched the news coverage of the review from a distance, his name never mentioned, his face never shown. He felt a strange mix of relief and resentment. Relief that the spotlight stayed off him. Resentment that the system could admit imperfection without acknowledging the cost it had imposed on his life. He wondered sometimes whether he would have preferred a different ending, one that hurt more but meant something clearer. The second man never saw the review. By then, his world had shrunk to routines and doctor's appointments, to mornings that began with pills and nights that ended early. He avoided mirrors. He avoided questions. The past had become less accusatory and more intimate, a companion he could neither confront nor escape. Whatever he knew, whatever he didn't, it lived with him now, untouchable by law or narrative. The family marked the 20th anniversary privately, lighting a candle in a room that had once held celebrations. They spoke the victim's name aloud, not for an audience, not for remembrance campaigns, but because saying it kept it real. They did not talk about suspects. They did not talk about theories. They talked about small things instead, habits, jokes, moments that had nothing to do with how the story ended and everything to do with how it began. In the wider world, the case slipped further into abstraction. It was referenced in academic papers, in podcasts dissecting failure and fallibility, in late-night conversations about whether justice was ever truly possible. Each retelling stripped away specificity, sanded down the edges until it became a concept rather than a life. The original night receded behind layers of interpretation, commentary, and distance. And yet, every so often the case surfaced again, triggered by something unrelated. A new arrest in an old murder. A breakthrough built on technology that hadn't existed before. Each time, hope flared briefly, not among investigators or lawyers, but among people who had followed the story from afar, who wanted to believe that patience was always rewarded, that truth waited obediently for the right tools. Inside the system, no such optimism existed. The file was reviewed one last time formally, its status unchanged. No new leads. No viables suspects. No prosecutable path forward. The language was careful, definitive in its restraint. The case would remain open but inactive. A classification that satisfied policy and nothing else. The city itself continued to transform. Streets renamed. Buildings replaced. The geography of the crime dissolved into a version of Sydney that no longer resembled the one from 2001. New generations walked past the area without knowing what had happened there, without feeling the weight older residents still carried unconsciously. History thinned as it spread. On rare nights when sleep came slowly, those closest to the case found themselves returning to the same questions, not because they expected answers, but because repetition had become ritual. What if someone had walked a different way? What if one call had been answered? What if a file had been read differently earlier? The questions no longer hurt sharply. They dulled, settling into familiarity. The cold case no longer demanded resolution. It endured. It existed as a reminder that certainty is often retrospective, constructed after the fact to make chaos tolerable, that investigations are human endeavors, bound by the same limits as memory and attention and fear, that some truths once missed do not circle back. As the years accumulated, the story reached a kind of equilibrium. Not peace, not justice. A steady state where nothing more could be taken from it and nothing more could be given. The night in 2001 had spent its force. What remained was echo, not impact. And somewhere beneath all the layers of review and retelling, beneath policy changes and personal reckonings, the core of the case stayed exactly where it had always been, unlit and unmoved. Not waiting to be solved. Not hoping to be understood. Simply existing, a fixed point in time that refused to align with the present, reminding anyone who looked too closely that some endings are not withheld, they simply do not exist. By the time the case reached its 25th year, it no longer felt unfinished in the way people usually mean. It felt complete in its incompleteness, sealed not by answers but by attrition. There were no more boxes to open, no more witnesses to age into courage, no more technology poised to resurrect what time had erased. The cold case had crossed an invisible threshold, from unresolved to unresolvable, and everyone who touched it sensed that crossing even if no one named it aloud. The file remained in the system, of course. It always would. A digital presence, searchable, inert, its status unchanged by the quiet understanding that nothing new would come. Every few years a form would be updated. A date refreshed. A box ticked to confirm continued inactivity. The machinery of justice required motion, even when there was nowhere left to go. The younger detective, now nearing the end of his own career, passed the story on the way all such stories are passed on, indirectly. Not as a warning. Not as a legend. Just as context. When trainees asked why certain protocols existed, why certain shortcuts were forbidden, he spoke about time, about momentum, about how certainty can form before truth does. He never mentioned names. He didn't need to. The case lived between the lines of his explanations, shaping minds that would never know its details. The acquitted man aged into obscurity. His face softened. His name lost its sharpness. New searches returned fewer results, buried beneath fresher stories, louder controversies. To strangers, he was just another man. To himself, he remained a survivor of something that had no vocabulary. A life interrupted by an accusation that never fully left. He stopped waiting for vindication. He learned to live without it. The second man died quietly, without ceremony. His passing noted in a local column, no one connected to anything else. There were no revelations. No confessions. No final words that rearranged the past. Whatever he carried with him went unshared, absorbed into the silence that had always surrounded the case. Speculation flared briefly, then faded, unable to feed on proof. The dead man, the third presence, remained what he had always been: a hypothesis, a shape drawn around absence. His name appeared occasionally in footnotes, in internal memos, in the margins of discussions that went nowhere. He could not be charged. He could not be cleared. He existed only as possibility, and possibility without consequence eventually loses its power. For the family, time did what nothing else could. It reduced the world to what mattered. They stopped measuring years by anniversaries and started measuring them by survivals. They carried the victim with them not as a question, but as a constant. The case, once a consuming force, became a distant weather system, always present, rarely active. They did not forgive. They did not forget. They endured. Sydney itself absorbed the story completely. The city that had once been shocked learned to live with the idea that not everything breaks cleanly. New tragedies came and went. New headlines demanded attention. The lane where it had happened disappeared beneath redevelopment. Its coordinates altered. Its memory displaced. People passed through the space without knowing why it felt ordinary. That was the final erasure, not of evidence but of context. And still, late at night, when the city quieted and the past felt closer than the future, the case surfaced in small private ways. In the pause before a detective closed a file. In the hesitation of a juror in another trial, weighing doubt more carefully. In the way a family held on to each other a little longer when someone didn't come home on time. These were the aftershocks, subtle but enduring. The cold case was never truly closed, despite the headline that once claimed it was. It was contained, neutralized, reduced to lessons and echoes. It no longer asked to be solved. It asked to be remembered accurately, without the comfort of resolution, without the lie of certainty. That is what remained when everything else fell away. Not a villain, not a verdict, but a night that refused interpretation, a sequence of moments that never aligned into narrative. A reminder that some truths are not hidden waiting to be found, but scattered beyond recovery, lost not to negligence or malice, but to time itself. And somewhere, locked into that summer night in 2001, the final version of events still exists, intact and inaccessible, unaltered by theory or technology or belief. It belongs to no one now. Not the police. Not the courts. Not the public. It exists only as it happened, in the dark, unseen, unrecorded. The city moves on above it. Lives continue. Systems improve. Stories end. But that one does not. It remains where it began, suspended between certainty and silence, a cold case not defined by the absence of answers, but by the unsettling knowledge that sometimes, even when everything possible has been done, the truth does not come back. What lingered after everything else had been said was not the case itself, but the habit it left behind, the reflex to look twice, to doubt first impressions, to listen longer than comfort allows. The cold case had rewritten behavior in ways no verdict ever could. It had taught restraint through failure, patience through loss, and suspicion of easy endings through their absence. In the department, its influence persisted quietly. New software flagged correlations, new protocols demanded redundancy, new supervisors insisted on devil's advocates in every major investigation. Younger officers chafed at the caution, mistaking it for hesitation. Older ones knew better. They had lived through a case that moved fast at the beginning and nowhere at the end. They had learned that speed, unchecked, could become its own kind of blindness. The case file was accessed one last time, not by a detective, not by a lawyer, but by an archivist tasked with standardizing legacy records. She read it not for answers, but for consistency, correcting dates, aligning formats, removing outdated terminology. To her, it was one of many tragic but not singular. And yet, something about it slowed her down. The absence of resolution. The density of effort without payoff. She added a note, purely administrative, marking the file as historically significant. It would be preserved indefinitely. That small decision mattered more than anyone realized. It ensured the case would not be quietly purged in some future efficiency drive. That it would remain accessible, intact, a reference point for generations that would never feel its emotional weight, but might still learn from its shape. Survival in archives is its own form of justice. Outside institutions, the story continued to mutate. A novelist fictionalized it, changing names, altering outcomes, delivering the ending reality never had. The book sold well. Readers praised its catharsis. Some believed it more readily than the truth, because it gave them what the real case never did: certainty. The family never read it. They didn't need someone else's ending layered over their own. A documentary followed, slick and restrained, careful not to accuse, careful not to absolve. It ended, inevitably, with unanswered questions and a slow fade to black. Viewers debated it briefly, then moved on. Attention, like justice, proved finite. Every so often, someone still came forward. Not with evidence, but with memory. A man who thought he'd seen something that night. A woman who remembered a scream she'd once dismissed as laughter. None could be verified. None could be disproven. They were received politely, logged respectfully, and added to the vast constellation of maybes that surrounded the core of the case like static. The family learned to recognize these moments by the tone of the phone call, the careful preamble, the apology for raising hopes. They listened. They thanked. They returned to their lives. The case no longer defined them, but it never left them either. It existed as a parallel timeline, one that ran alongside everything else, invisible but constant. Sydney changed again. New transport lines. New skylines. New rhythms. The city that had been shocked in 2001 became a city that absorbed shock routinely, its capacity for outrage dulled by repetition. And yet, beneath that surface, the lesson remained. In the way police lights drew curtains. In the way late trains made people uneasy. In the way silence after midnight felt heavier than it should. The cold case was no longer a question people asked aloud. It was an answer they carried implicitly. That not everything resolves, that effort does not guarantee outcome, that truth is not obligated to cooperate. It became part of the city's emotional infrastructure, invisible but load-bearing. If there was an ending, it was not an event but a condition, a state of knowing without understanding, of acceptance without peace. The case had exhausted every mechanism designed to contain it, and in doing so, it exposed their limits. Law had reached its boundary. Science had reached its margin. Memory had reached its decay. What remained was story without conclusion, impact without closure. A night that continued to cast a shadow disproportionate to its length. Hours that reshaped decades. A moment that refused to shrink with distance. And perhaps that was the final truth the case offered. Not about guilt or innocence, but about time itself. That some moments do not pass. They accumulate. They embed. They persist not because they are unsolved, but because they are unsolvable in the ways we demand. The cold case stayed where it always had, not waiting, not hiding, simply existing as proof that even in a world built on answers, uncertainty has its own permanence. And the city, unaware and yet shaped by it, continued on, carrying a story it could never finish telling, moving forward over ground that remembered everything. By the time people began asking whether the story had gone on too long, the answer no longer mattered. Length had ceased to be the measure. The case had detached itself from chronology and entered something closer to inheritance, passed quietly from one generation to the next, not as a warning etched in stone, but as a subtle adjustment to how the city understood risk, absence, and the fragile promise of answers. Children who had not yet been born in 2001 grew up hearing fragments without context. A teacher mentioning an old investigation in a civics class. A parent lowering their voice when passing a certain block. A late-night radio host referencing that Sydney cold case as shorthand for uncertainty itself. No details, just recognition. The case no longer needed facts to survive. It had become a symbol. Inside the system, the file was rarely opened but never forgotten. Every now and then during a slow shift or a training exercise, someone would pull it up out of curiosity, scroll through scanned pages, feel the density of effort pressed into digital space. They would read the same names others had read, follow the same branching paths, reach the same dead ends. And almost always they would close it with the same quiet understanding. Nothing more could be done without pretending. That understanding was not defeat. It was maturity, a recognition that investigation has limits, and that crossing those limits does not produce truth, only distortion. The case had taught that lesson more effectively than any seminar ever could. It had failed loudly enough to instruct silently. The city's relationship with the night changed too, in ways that were never formally acknowledged. Streets were better lit. Transport ran later. Cameras multiplied. None of it could be traced directly back to one crime, but all of it carried the same subtext. Never again, even if no one could articulate what again meant. Policy rarely admits its emotional origins. In private, people still imagined endings. They always would. The human mind resists unresolved narratives the way the body resists infection. Some believed the truth had been obvious all along, hidden in plain sight, ignored because it was inconvenient. Others believed the case had been doomed by chance, by the wrong people crossing paths at the wrong moment. A few believed the truth had surfaced briefly and been buried again, deliberately or otherwise. None of these beliefs could be proven. All of them served a purpose. The family reached a point where the case no longer dominated their conversations. It surfaced occasionally, uninvited, but it no longer dictated the rhythm of their lives. They learned to hold two realities at once: the life that had been lost, and the life that had continued anyway. They stopped waiting for permission to move forward. They did so quietly, without fanfare, without forgetting. There was no final document. No closing ceremony. No last headline to mark the end of attention. The story simply thinned, spread out over time until it was everywhere and nowhere at once. The cold case did not fade. It diffused. And yet, in the rare moments when everything else fell silent, when the city paused between breaths, the shape of the night in 2001 still asserted itself, not as a sequence of events but as a feeling, a tension. A reminder that something had happened that would never be fully explained, and that this absence was now part of the city's architecture, as real as any bridge or road. The truth, whatever it was, no longer belonged to the living. It had outlasted witnesses, suspects, investigators, and advocates. It existed independently now, sealed into the moment it was created, immune to reinterpretation. The case had become less about discovery and more about acceptance of limits. And so the story did not end. It stabilized. It remained as a quiet presence beneath the noise of modern life, beneath progress and distraction and certainty, reminding anyone who listened closely enough that some questions are not unanswered because they are difficult, but because they arrived in a world incapable of holding them. The city continued. The system evolved. People lived and died without knowing the details of a night that had shaped so much of what followed. And somewhere, beyond reach and beyond correction, the truth stayed exactly where it had always been, untouched by time, unclaimed by justice, existing not as a solution, but as a permanent absence that refused to be filled. The absence eventually became familiar enough that it stopped feeling like a wound and started feeling like terrain. People navigated around it without thinking, stepping over the invisible line where certainty would have been. The case had shaped the ground, even if no one could point to the moment it hardened. Every so often, something small would disturb the surface. A misremembered detail resurfacing in a conversation. An old photograph rediscovered in a drawer, edges curled, faces half forgotten. A new technology promising clarity, only to stall against the same limitations that had stopped everything before. Each time there was a flicker, brief and contained like static discharging. Then silence reclaimed its space. In the department, a senior officer nearing retirement gave a talk on legacy. He spoke about metrics and clearances, about cases solved and careers built. Then, almost as an aside, he mentioned the ones that never closed, the investigations that did everything right and still failed to arrive anywhere definitive. He didn't name the Sydney case. He didn't need to. Everyone in the room felt it settle between them, the unspoken example that had outlived most of its participants. He said something that stayed with them long after. That justice is an aspiration, not a guarantee. That the system is designed to reduce harm, not eliminate it. That certainty is rare, and pretending otherwise does damage of its own. It wasn't comforting. It was honest. And honesty, after everything, felt like the closest thing to resolution the case would ever offer. Outside that room, life moved forward with its usual indifference. People argued over smaller things, laughed at larger ones, made plans assuming tomorrow would behave itself. The city no longer flinched at the mention of cold cases. It had too many of them now, layered over time, each one competing for space in collective memory. This one receded not because it mattered less, but because it had already given everything it could. The family reached an age where the future grew shorter than the past. They spoke less about what might have been proven and more about what had been lived. The victim's presence became less defined by loss and more by continuity, a thread woven into their identities rather than a hole torn through them. They stopped waiting for the system to return something it had never promised. On a quiet afternoon, one of them walked past the redevelopment where the crime had once anchored itself to geography. There was no marker. No plaque. Just glass and movement and reflected sky. They stood there for a moment, not expecting recognition, not demanding acknowledgement. Just confirming that the place existed, that it had not been erased entirely, even if nothing there suggested why it should matter. That was the strange finality of it. The case had not ended in revelation or reckoning, but in normalization. It had become part of the background of existence, like weather patterns or traffic noise, something you learn to live with rather than resolve. The story, when told now, sounded different. Less sharp. Less accusatory. It was no longer about who did it or even how. It was about how long a question could persist without destroying the people who carried it. About how institutions adapt when they cannot win. About how communities absorb uncertainty and keep functioning anyway. The cold case had outlasted outrage, outlasted hope, outlasted even disappointment. What remained was perspective. A recognition that not every wrong is balanced, not every loss redeemed. That sometimes the most honest outcome is endurance. And so the case settled into its final form, not closed, not active, not solved, but integrated. A fixed absence around which everything else adjusted. A reminder embedded so deeply it no longer needed attention to exert influence. Somewhere in the city, on a street that no longer resembled its past, night fell as it always did. Lights came on. Voices drifted. Someone checked the time and decided to head home. Nothing marked the moment. Nothing needed to. The truth stayed where it had always been, unclaimed and unreachable. Not waiting to be found. Not demanding recognition. Just there. And that, at last, was enough to let the rest of the world keep moving.